There's an Irish poem that talks about a great clan leader named Owen. It says, sagest in the council was he, kindest in the hall. We never won a battle, 'twas Owen won them all. I think that for people in my generation, that's the way we always thought of David Bonior. We might have had our own political ambitions, our own things to do, but first and foremost, the greatest loyalty was to make sure that David got reelected, because he was our symbol of what we all stood for. For a generation, he defined us here in Macomb County. The people who worked on his organization were special because they were hardworking, they knew politics, and most importantly, they were driven by ideals. He took those ideals to Washington, and for a generation, he kind of commanded the conscience of the House of Representatives. He was just that kind of guy. I know a couple of years ago when he was running for governor, Steve Steinhardt, who is here, arranged a meeting at the Birmingham Temple, a group of supporters, possible supporters. But I think you know that David, because of his passion for social justice, was always worried about displaced people, the people in, loosely called the Palestinians, who were dispossessed by perhaps some actions that were happening in the Middle East. And so, although he was a staunch supporter of Israel, there was always this kind of tension because his passion for social justice did not allow him to just forget about the plight of Arabic peoples who were displaced also. And so we went to that meeting knowing that there was this possible difference. But while we were there, it was very clear that whatever the perceived minor differences there possibly could be, everybody recognized that this was a person of deep principles. And if he believed something, it wasn't because of any cheap political reason. It was because there was a substantial issue of justice, a real reason to do whatever he did. We are so proud and so lucky to have had him in Macomb County, so proud and happy that he represented us in the Congress of the United States. Just think of all of the negative things that maybe have occurred in our lifetime that would make us not feel that proud to be in Macomb County. But if he were our representative, people in Washington looked at us and said, boy, they got to be good people because they sent us that guy. Really, the person who I think, Phil Hart was the conscience of the Senate. I think that David Bonior was the conscience of the House. And we're so happy to have him here tonight. David.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's lovely. Thank you. Very nice. Thank you. Wow, that was really very lovely, Carl. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful introduction. But Carl and I have known each other for a very long time. He's been a great friend and a great supporter, a great judge and a great prosecutor. And I used to work at the probate court. I worked there 50 years ago. And now, as the world would have it, everything comes around and he runs the place. So you go figure. Anyway, it's great to be with Carl again. I also want to thank Steve Steinhardt, who's a magnificent guy. He's got a lot of energy, a lot of insight into history, and he cares about history, and he's a great organizer, and thank you for all you did. You did a lot of things for this event. He deserves a round of applause. And the Macomb Bar Foundation is sponsoring this as well, and the fact that they're doing this history program here at Barnes Noble in the county so we can learn about not only national history, but state history, but our local history is very, very exciting. Okay, and we have a lot of friends and supporters here that worked with me for many, many years, and I can't thank them enough for always being at events and supporting the things that we do. So I'm not going to name them. They know who they are. They've been recognized, and we thank them. And finally, there's one special, Carl, guest that I want to particularly introduce you to. This person's name is Helen Livingston. And Helen happens to be the person who has known me the oldest because Helen was present at my birth. This was almost 70 years ago at Old St. Joe's Hospital on East Grand Boulevard in Detroit. My mother gave birth to me. her sister and Helen were best friends, and Helen was obviously a friend of my mother. My dad was away fighting the war in Germany and in France at that time. So we've known Helen a long time. They moved from Hamtramck as well to East Detroit, and they were on the same block that we were, so we watched their kids grow up. We socialized with them. We actually ended up working at the probate court together, Helen and I, in the youth home, right? In the youth home. So anyway, we've known each other for a long time, and she was very instrumental in this book because she helped me reconstruct all those early years. Her and Helen, Martha Molkoff, they were really wonderful. Helen is 95 and will be 96 in January. Helen, stand up and be recognized. And I want to tell you, she gave one heck of an interview, and we used it. I used it very well, and I hope, in the book, and I hope she'll like it. First of all, I want to talk about the book a little bit, and then I'll intermittently, if I can find the place in the book, read you 4 or 5 little pieces out of it so you get a flavor of what it's all about. First of all, I want to say the book is not about my congressional career. I am presently writing that book, and we'll have that hopefully in the next year and a half. Rather, it's about a book about my early life. It's about the attitudes and values and experiences that shaped me and that set the foundation that enabled me to have a public life. It's a book about place. It's a book about Detroit, Hamtramck, East Detroit, Iowa City, Iowa, at the University of Iowa where I went to school. It's about a place in Southern California where I served in the Air Force, and it's about, of course, Lansing and Mount Clemens. So it's a book about place, and I describe in the book these places, I think, and I think hopefully it will capture your attention and your interest. You know, Detroit back in the 50s and 60s and the early 40s was, at its zenith. It was one of the greatest cities, not only in the country, but in the world. It had close to 2 million people, 1.8 million, and it was thought to have maybe be rivaling Chicago at that point in its history. It had wonderful neighborhoods, it had pretty good schools, it had a great downtown. Streets were teeming with people. I think and remember fondly of my mother getting on the Baker streetcar with me and Hamtramck and going downtown, shopping at Hudson's, and then later we used to do the same thing on 8 Mile and Gratiot and take that streetcar. By the way, those streetcars, they sold them in '55 to Mexico City, 186 streetcars, and they ran for about 40 or 50 years down in Mexico after they sold them, and they were relatively new, but I won't get off into streetcars because we don't have enough time for that tonight. But Detroit was a fabulous place growing up when I was younger. Hamtramck was a special place. 70% of the people were Polish, 10% Ukrainian and Russian, maybe a few Russians, and then 20% African American. And these parishes like St. Florian's and St. Lad's and Queen of Apostles and Immaculate Conception, the Ukrainian church and school, and the Corinthian Baptist Church for the African Americans, they were vibrant, vital communities. And people spoke Polish on the streets, they spoke Polish in the stores. My grandparents, the Polish grandparents that I had that came from Krakow, could not speak English their whole life that they were here. They didn't really need to in a way because everybody on the block spoke Polish. Stanley was Stasiu, Wally was Vaju, everybody had David was David or Davidko. Everybody, the people in the stores spoke Polish, the paper was in Polish. It had a real Polish culture. And the thing that kept Hamtramck really alive and together was Dodge, Maine, where my grandfather worked for 30 years. Dodge, Maine was in operation from 1922 to roughly 1981 when they tore it down to build Poletown. And it employed roughly 30,000 people. 30,000 people. And during the war in the 40s, it went up to 40,000 people. So it was a very important and special place. And East Detroit, where I know many folks here are from or still live in East Detroit, has an interesting history that I'm not going to go into, but just say that it used to be called Orange Township, and then when the Irish and Germans moved in, when land was a buck an acre, they changed it. These were Catholics from Germany and Ireland. They changed the Orange to Erin Township. And then they changed it to Halfway because it was halfway between Mount Clemens and Detroit. And then when the Detroit prominence was really high, they piggybacked onto Detroit, and it was called East Detroit. And then they decided that they wanted to call it East Point. My dad and I never call it East Point, but that's what they wanted to do, so it became East Point. So it's got really a wonderful history, and it had wonderful neighborhoods as well. I grew up in the St. Veronica neighborhood as well as a lot of these fine folks that came here today to be with us. It's a great city. This book is also about class. You know, the East Side was basically working class. It had its managers, but it was mostly working class. And growing up on the East Side was significant because my grandfather, as I said, who lived with us, worked at Dodge, Main. My dad had a one-man print shop. So I have very fond memories of working. Actually, Russ over here and I used to work road construction. I worked tunnel construction as a kid. I worked in R.C. Mahone's steel fabricating mill for a while, and long enough to get my steel worker union card. So I had a sense of what workers went through and what they were up against, and that basically was the East Side. And so I really have a fondness for identifying with the underdog, you know, to the man and the woman who got up every day and they packed the lunch and punched the clock and, you know, poured their heart and soul into their work. And those were the folks that lived predominantly on the East Side. It's a book about sports and religion, and I'll tell you why when I, in a second, get to the first reading. I was a very quiet kid. I was a shy kid, and I was in a home where my mother was pretty ill most of my childhood, and she had a heart attack. She had an open heart operation, and then she passed away at 37. But I had to find a retreat like most people do when they're undergoing some kinds of pressure. And my retreat was religion and the Roman Catholic Church, and the other retreat I had was sports. So I did a lot of sports, and the book has got a lot of sports, and it's got a fair amount of religion in it as well. So it's a book about sports and religion also. I'm going to do the first reading right now, and I hope my voice will hold up and you'll be able to hear me in the back. This first chapter of the book is entitled Memory Repressed, and it actually is an introduction, but I read a statistic once that only 40% of readers read the introduction of a book. So I decided to label it Chapter 1 because I thought it was important that people look at this. This is about, my sister and I were talking about my mother recently, actually. This was the last chapter, one of the last chapters I did in the book. And my sister reminded me of the open heart surgery that my mother had back I'm trying to think of it's in here. But it was in the mid-50s, 1950s, and late 1950s. And it was a very unusual operation at that time. And I had repressed the fact that she had this operation. I remember the heart attack she had. We were waiting to go to see Austin High play East Detroit High in a Class A basketball championship in the cold of winter, and she collapsed on the sidewalk waiting to get in. My dad was off trying to get tickets somewhere, and we loaded Mom into the car. My sister and I got in there with her and drove down to Saratoga about 100 miles an hour. And my sister was crouched underneath the dashboard. She was so scared in that car. But anyway, I remember that, and I remember, of course, the day she died. But I don't remember that particular operation, which was significant. So I'm going to start reading. As I listened to Nancy tell me about this, elements began to seep back into my consciousness. But there were still blanks, supplementing what I recovered with details recalled only by Nancy. I was able to reconstruct the story of the surgery. Mother's weak heart had begun to sap her stamina prior to the heart attack. Afterward, she became fatigued even more easily. Simple everyday activities were beyond her capacity. She was unable to climb the steps at St. Veronica's to go to Mass. She was unable to perform basic chores on behalf of her family, her husband, and her 3 children. and her father, who lived with us, my grandfather, my Ukrainian grandfather. Her health was slipping away, and we were all worried. Her doctors decided to operate. As the date approached, the surgery became the #1 topic in our family. But in the years following her death, I somehow blocked out from my memory not only the surgery, but also our concern in the weeks before it. Nancy explained to me that the operation took 8 hours. I don't know exactly what was done, but I do know that in the 1950s, open heart surgery was new. It had not been practiced and repeated and refined to the point where today it's serious and complicated, but nonetheless a routine procedure. Following the surgery, Mother remained in the hospital for quite a while, weeks probably, to begin her recuperation. Nancy, 11 at the time, recalls both of us visiting Mother there. I, then 13, don't. Nancy further reminded me that after Mother came home, she spent much of each day resting in bed, and that our father and grandfather instructed us to be quiet in the house. Do not disturb Mother, they would say. Nancy told me that this state of affairs went on for months, changing dramatically the rhythms of our life. The fragility of my mother's health was one of the central themes of my upbringing. Another was the paucity of verbal communication in our household, especially on the part of my father and grandfather. Each man's demeanor was serious, his sense of discipline strict. Only our mother and our baby brother softened the sober atmosphere of our home. Mary McGrory, the longtime political columnist for the Washington Post, once described me in print as funereal. The description didn't please me, but I knew it to be true. That was my look, all right. When I gazed in the mirror, I saw the stern face of my father and grandfather staring back. My early childhood had been happy. I'd found joy in my narrow world filled with family, sports, and the Roman Catholic Church. But adolescence and my mother's illness changed my visage. I'd learned my father's and grandfather's lessons well. The tragedy of my mother's early death notwithstanding, I was able to scale, sometimes just barely, the heights necessary to advance in life and to end up with a long career in government service. I had reached the highest levels of leadership in our federal government. I sat and spoke with presidents of the United States, heads of state and governments from around the world, fellow congressional leaders, and thousands of my Michigan constituents. We discussed the most significant issues facing our communities, our nation, and the world. And through it all, I pushed myself never to forget that I was an Eastside Kid, the son of Detroit's working class who grew up loving underdogs. And if I tried to do anything during my years in government, it was to fight for those underdogs. What I accomplished in Congress was and is important. Recalling my achievements there is important too, and will fill a second volume. But understanding and remembering what came before, the people, the places, and the events that shaped me, the maze I had to navigate to get to Washington, is no less significant. I've reached a point in my life, I'm 69 years old at this writing, at which I've decided to take stock. In reviewing my history, some memories have come easily, some through the aid of friends and family members interviewed for this project, and some barely at all. Unearthing the happy memories as well as the painful ones has helped me to better understand my failures as well as my successes. Going back through my early life, trying to best figure out what I was thinking at any given time and why, elbowing my way into memory, has presented its own rewards, although not without discomfort. Fortunately, the satisfaction has far outweighed the discomfort. So here is the story of my youth. It starts with my grandparents and my parents, with large and small towns in Ukraine and Poland, and with an American town where I took my first step, said my first word, and learned the fundamental lessons that made me the legislator I was and the person I will always be. The second chapter of the book deals with my grandparents and my mother and father. I do a little bit on each of them. And to understand that better, I took a trip with my wife, Judy, and my sister, Nancy, and her daughter and husband to Ukraine to visit my grandfather's village in western Ukraine called Stetseva. And then after that, we went to Krakow, where my Polish grandparents were from, and to try to understand what they were up against when they left about 1910, 1912, in both instances, what it was like there. It was difficult. There was a book reviewer in the Washington Post by the name of Ron Charles who said I read this recently, he said something that really kind of registered with me. He said, with every act of migration, there is a sense of betrayal. And basically what that means is that the people who migrate from wherever it is, from Europe or from Mexico or you name it, they're leaving their home, they're leaving their family, they're leaving the things that are closest to them, people that love them, to come to do what they're doing, often for safety or economic reasons. And I think, you know, this is just me speaking, but I think we need to have less scorn and more honor for those folks who do that. A publisher told me they didn't want to do the book because I had this chapter in there about my grandparents. And I said, oh, well, then you're not going to do the book, because I want that story to be understood by my family and by my kids and my grandkids. I think it's important. So the second chapter is about that immigration from those places to this country. The third chapter deals with the town of Hamtramck. And you know, it's place again. But for a 4- and a 6-year-old, place is a different thing. Place is what? It's the house, it's the home, it's where you grew up. So I've taken a little piece here I want to read to you. It's shorter than the last one. And I go through every room in the house, probably a little bit too much, but anyway, it's what I remembered. And I'm getting to the basement, and here's the paragraph on the basement. A stern man, Grandpa kept the two of us, my sister and I, out of the basement for a couple of years. That's where the boogeyman lived, or so he said. Evidently, he liked to scare us in a good-natured way, or so he must have thought. But what do a 6- and a 4-year-old know about the reality of a dark place that was, in fact, nothing more than a coal bin? Nancy and I were petrified of the boogeyman. So much so that we both had dreams of being chased by him. My dreams had me fleeing as he chased me up the basement stairs. He never caught me, but it was tough climbing those steps with the monster nipping at my heels. Grandpa did scare us, recalls Nancy. He had those Eastern European kind of old Ukrainian, Romanian, bizarre ways. When I think of his life, he left Europe at 18. He had an education only up to the 3rd or 4th grade, so he must have worked in the fields and had a pretty primitive life, which he did. Probably a lot of those primitive ways were with him and then passed on to us. By the time I was 6, however, about the time I started to harbor a little bit of doubt about the existence of Santa Claus, I had developed the courage to confront the demon in the coal bin. I carefully descended the stairs into the basement and slowly approached the opening where a pile of coal lay in a small bin on the kitchen side of the house. I peeked in, prepared to hightail it back up the steps to the safety of the kitchen and my mother's loving arms. When no one appeared, I carefully entered the pitch black. Nothing but coal. Well, once the terror lifted, I could spend time in the basement, and there was a lot to see. A large coal-fired boiler sat in the middle of the floor. I would watch the red-hot coals through the opening in a small door. About 10 feet away from the boiler was a wash basin, and I would watch as my mother would scrub the men's dirty clothing from the auto and print shops on an old-fashioned scrub board, then run the garments through the rollers of a wringer that you cranked by hand. Remember those? The other end of the basement contained a small storage room where our family stored odds and ends, treasures to a 6-year-old, like oil cans and balls of string and tools and nuts and bolts and a pile of small boards that I would use to make crude little boats. There were even guitars and ukuleles, apparently left by a boarder years earlier when the family had rented out a room. The door to this room was always open, always inviting me to explore and create, and I love those old guitars and ukuleles. So that gives you a little bit of a sense, hopefully, of the idea of the places that I grew up in and lived and meant a lot to me. The next selection I want to read to you is I talked about religion, and it was really important in my life, and I know it is in many people here in this room as well. First Holy Communion was a great experience. How many had First Holy Communion here? So you all know. I mean, the idea that you could have a personal relationship with God at 7 years of age was pretty mind-blowing, you know? So I really was into that, and I fed on that, and I would watch during Mass, because we all had to go to Mass before school started. I went to parochial school, St. Florian's and then St. Veronica's. I would watch the altar boys up on the altar assisting the priest, and I always wanted to be an altar boy. So I got my chance to be an altar boy, and I was a candidate for becoming one, but I had much to learn. We had memorized the Latin responses to the priest's prayers at Mass and mastered the precise choreograph of each part of the ceremony. Altar boys also had to prepare the items used. Prior to the Mass, we filled the crucibles with wine that was kept in the sacristy. The strong, sweet aroma of the wine was a strange wake-up to us at 6 a.m., the time of the first day's Mass. We also lit the altar candle. Sometimes that job was more complicated than it had to be, thanks to a trick the boys from the previous Mass might play on us. Using, as we always did, an altar stick to extinguish the candles at the end of the Mass, they would smash the sticks down hard, burying the wick under the hot melted wax. Because the candles were so high up on the altar, we couldn't see the conditions of the wicks as we held up the wand, which was the candle lighter stash snuffer, to light the candles for the next Mass. St. Veronica was a huge parish with 4 Masses on Sunday morning. If this was the 9:45 Sunday Mass, perhaps 1,000 worshipers would be watching as 2 11 or 12-year-olds would be unable to get the candles burning so that the service could begin. Snickering might fill the church. An unwelcome tension would bind the congregation together. Meanwhile, the priest would be in the sacristy thinking that he had another Mass in an hour and a quarter and needed to get this one underway. Serving Mass became a regular and indispensable fiber woven through the fabric of my life, affording me both the spiritual comfort and temporal stature. On weekdays, I would rise at 5 in the morning and trudge to church. The quiet of the morning seemed to be all ours. Catholic children are taught they are protected by their own guardian angel. He was my partner in these mystical duties. Inside the sacristy, I donned my cassock and began my ordered rituals. First, I would light the altar candles. Then I would fill the crucibles with water and red wine so dark and pungent that I was reminded of my place as a child in this most solemn of religious expressions. With our hands palmed together and our fingers pointing to the heavens, the priest and I together entered the altar from the sacristy. The half-dozen elderly parishioners would slowly rise out of respect, wanting to ever so much be close to their Maker as their own time drew near. High in the choir loft in the rear of the church, Mrs. Lenhart would play the organ and sing in her angelic morning voice, which would fall like soft snow on the mostly empty pews. Standing at the foot of the altar, the priest would cross himself and recite in Latin, In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Amen. Introibo altari Dei. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost, Amen, I will go to the altar of God. Kneeling beside the priest, I would respond in my new acquired language, Ad Diem qui latificat juventutem meum, to God the joy of my youth. And so it would continue for the whole Mass, the priest praising and I answering, both of us in Latin during the time before the Second Vatican Council changed the language of the Mass to the vernacular. The climax of the service was the transubstantiation. So profound was this moment that I felt privileged to ring the altar bells as the celebrant lifted the host and then the chalice of wine high above his head for all to witness the miracle. The honor of serving Mass with its rituals and responsibilities and new language was a seminal experience for me. Assigned to a Sunday service, I would be seen by thousands of parishioners. Assisting at baptisms, weddings, and funerals, I was witness to the full circle of life, the joy and grief, rich and poignant, embedded in the rituals of my faith. From a safe place, windows opened to a bigger world. My understanding of people and of myself deepened. I found spiritual grounding and peace of mind. The church would be both an anchor and a lighthouse in my life. This experience led to recruitment by the parish priest to the seminary. So I evidently served Mass so well they wanted me to become a priest. So anyway, I ended up going to the seminary for 1 year. But something drew me out of that. Celibacy was one piece of it. Academics was another. Because my Latin, despite I thought I did reasonably well reading that today, was kind of shaky. But I really wanted to play sports, and I wanted to go to St. Ambrose. And I know there are some St. Ambrose alumni here. And I wanted to join my friend Mike Goff at St. Ambrose. He was my best friend, but that wasn't to be. So I ended up leaving and going to Notre Dame High School and playing sports there, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. This is the fourth of the 5 stories, and this is one that will take a little bit of time, but I think we've got a few more minutes, so please bear with me. It was Friday, November 18th, 1960, and my mother was scheduled for a test at Harper Hospital before traveling to New York City with my father on a trip that would combine his business with a little pleasure for both of them. We thought nothing of the medical test. We were just excited that Mother would be accompanying Dad on this trip to the Big Apple. For me, Friday meant the end of the school week. What's more, I was delighted to be among the 40,000 fans at Briggs Stadium that evening to see St. Ambrose play Cooley High School for the city football championship. Mike Goff was playing, and I was thrilled for him. St. Ambrose won, culminating a wonderful night. After the game, I got a ride with John Carlin back to his house, which was on 7 Mile in Kelly area. 30-minute walk home took me past 15 street corners, each with lit with a street lamp. Fantasizing someday that I too would get a chance to play in the big game, under each lamp I would set a pose and watch my shadow. One pose might be me crouching, getting ready to plow through the line like the famous Heisman-winning running back Howard Hopalong Cassidy, the Ohio State star who carried the ball for the Lions during their glory years in the 1950s. Another might be with my leg extended high in the air as if I was punting a ball a la Lou the Toe Groza. At each corner, my shadow became my companion as I playfully choreographed my way home. I reached Eagle Avenue about 11:30. I turned the corner and saw that numerous cars were parked along the curb near our house. We had a large picture window in the front of the house. I could see that inside in the living room were relatives and friends. Something was wrong. I went around to the back door, my usual point of entry into the house. And before I got there, my father met me in the backyard. I could see on his face that he had something important to tell me. He looked at me and I stopped moving. "Your mother died," he said without hesitation. "Go inside and take it like a man." No comforting, no hug, no touching of any kind, no tears, no explanation. I walked into the house, through the kitchen, and into the living room. The room turned quiet. All eyes were on me as I was the last family member to know. Dazed, I didn't say a word. I went straight to my room. I sat on the side of my bed trying to comprehend what I had just heard, what I had just seen. I was no stranger to death. I'd served all those funeral masses as an altar boy. But this was our mother, who was so young. Father Divine entered my room. He told me how sorry he was. "Your mother is in heaven," he said. He talked about God's will and all the things the priests say at times like this. His voice was quiet and tender. He was doing his best. I heard him and I didn't. His soothing voice was like consoling background music, but my mind was focused on trying to comprehend this earth-shaking event, on starting to take in how painfully I would miss her, on feeling the intensity of my sadness at not having said goodbye to her. I felt bewildered and stunned. I felt sad, but shock overwhelmed everything else. She was only going in for a test, not for an operation. She and Dad were going on a trip. How could she have died? Nancy learned the news before I did. I was home with my grandfather, she recalls. My father came home with Aunt Nellie and Uncle Landy, and they told us. It was heartbreaking. They told us right there as soon as they walked in the door because they were filled with so much emotion and grief. Nobody did any comforting. All I remember is everybody walking around crying, not knowing what to do. Many people came to the wake, held at the funeral home, Schultz Funeral Home, to pay their respects. Relatives, friends, priests, nuns, political acquaintances of my dad's. My classmates came by and I thanked them. I was depressed, but tears came only when Mike Goff put his hand on my shoulder. I broke down. It had taken 3 days, but his presence and touch got me there. Jeff, not quite 5 years old, tried to make sense of the events as best he could. At the funeral home, he recalls, we had to go outside the side door to the cemetery. She was lying in the open casket. My dad was holding me, and I said, "Come on, Mommy, we're leaving." I didn't know what was going on. Our father asked his sister, our Aunt Marie, to accompany the family on a trip to New York. My guess is it was the same business trip he intended to take with my mom. Dad felt it would be good for all of us to get away as a family. He was determined to keep us together and to move us all forward. For us kids, this was our first trip out of Michigan. We traveled by car and stayed at the Waldorf Astoria on Park Avenue. The exclusive accommodations told me that Dad must have been traveling on government business because there was no way we could afford to stay there on our own. The trip was a kind idea, but we all would have been much better off just talking about Mom and what had happened. The circumstances of her health remained opaque, or death remained opaque, and our feelings about it stayed locked inside into each of us. Instead of talking, Dad took Nancy to see a Broadway show. While Marie stayed with Jeff, I went by myself to see Elgin Baylor play basketball at Madison Square Garden. Afterwards, we all went out to eat at Mama Leone's. We were running away from, instead of confronting, the tragedy that had just dramatically changed all of our lives. In later years, I wondered why my father broke the news of my mother's death to me the way he did. In a way, it makes sense. He was not a man who shared his emotions with others. I remember only one time when he told me that he loved me, and that was the day before he died. In his later years, he might occasionally sign a birthday card, "Love, Dad." It was special to see those words, which had been such a long time coming. Perhaps Dad's cold emotional response to life, or perhaps more accurately, lack of emotional response, stemmed from his service in the Army. Surviving World War II and being witness to so much death and destruction might have triggered an emotional shutdown, a shutdown he might have thought enabled him to maintain his mental equilibrium, when in fact it did the opposite, eating away at him slowly for over half a century. Or maybe Dad's grief that chilly November night was so pronounced, so overwhelming, that he had only one way to tell me what had happened. Cold, short, and with a message to buck up, to take it like a man, like he did, in other words. I doubt that I will ever know the answer. I should have asked him in later years, but I did not. I was afraid to open up this part of our lives. And so, in that way, I indeed was my father's son. I wish I knew all my family better. My maternal grandmother, whom I never met, died at 37. Her husband, whom I shared a home until I was 18. My father, whose hard outer shell was too much for me to penetrate. And my mother, who died decades too young. At home after the trip to New York, I felt a huge void. I had my mother for 15 years, but seeing my brother daily reminded me that because he was only 4 years and 9 months of age when she died, he might not remember her and the love she gave to him. My sister lost the only other female member of our house. My grandfather, who had lost his wife when she was in her mid-30s, had now lost his youngest daughter at the same age. My father had lost his wife and the mother of his children. A thick pall of grief lay upon our house. At night, I dreamed about her returning to our family. I wanted it so much I could feel it happening. And while my sister, my father, and I were processing her loss at night, we would hear my grandfather's moans and nightmares. It was as though we were each going through our own nocturnal therapy session, each of us dealing with the loss alone, aware of the collective grief, but unable to join forces to confront it. The sadness was everywhere, in our silence, on our faces, in our steps, and the grief was strangling us slowly. We could not survive this way. So those from the outside, recognizing our pain, came forward. Aunt Nell and Uncle Andy spent a lot of time with Jeff and Nancy. My father's friends were there for him as they drew him deeper into politics and city affairs, and I could feel the concern of teachers and coaches, so I plunged into school and sports. That's what you do. You go forward. So, obviously an important part of my growing up, and I'm happy I could share that with you. let me transition briefly to sports. I'm not going to read anything, but just tell you what happened there. So if you're interested, you might want to read this part of the book. I was a pretty good athlete. My father was 6'4". He was a great basketball player in high school, played for a half a semester in college before he left. And he was a great baseball player. He could throw a ball, he could throw a curve, a fastball. I have pictures of him in the St. Louis Browns uniform doing batting practice for St. Louis before the game with the Tigers at Briggs Stadium. And he would have probably pitched certainly the minors, but in the major leagues because he was that good. Of course, the war came along and took him away, as it did many people who were interested in athletics and professional sports at that time. So I had this view that, man, I could be 6'4" like my dad, and I could throw the ball farther, I could run pretty fast. You know, I might have a career, and my dad thought I might have a career in sports. So my ticket to the future was not in books, but it was in athletics. And I knew, I had this into my mind, that the only way I'm going to get to college and be able to afford it was a sports scholarship. So I had a good career as a 6th, 7th, and 8th grader, if you can believe calling that a career, but it was. We had the CYO football, baseball, and basketball. We had 105 teams in the Detroit area that played CYO sports then, 105 parishes. And it was big time. It was so big that not only the Michigan Catholic covered this issue of sports and CYO sports, and the local parish papers, but the news and the free press would cover it because they recognized what a reach it had into the community. I played my freshman year basketball in the seminary. I averaged 13 points a game as a freshman. I was feeling good. That's one of the reasons I left the seminary, because I thought I might be able to play basketball as well as football. The upshot of the story is I ended up going to Notre Dame High School, had a terrible junior year, but a very good senior year. And we were champions of our division. We had a good basketball season, and I kept getting these letters in the mail from these schools wanting me to go there. A lot of schools around the country, but unfortunately not Michigan or Michigan State, because Michigan State understood my limitations. But I wanted to go to a Big Ten school, so I ended up going to the University of Iowa. Indiana wanted me, and Iowa wanted me, and Iowa was familiar because they had recruited a lot of people out of the Detroit area. So I ended up going there. And when I got to Iowa, I was not on a full scholarship. In fact, the coach for Iowa told me at the athletic banquet my senior year that he would give me a full scholarship once I got there, but he had given out his 33. He couldn't give me one. So I got there, and freshman back then, you couldn't play varsity football. So I'm playing freshman football, and the first day of practice, all the linemen over here, all the backs over here, all the linebackers over here, all the quarterbacks over here. We have 33 guys on scholarship, 13 were quarterbacks. And I said, holy God, I'm here in Iowa. I'm never going to play. Well, it turned out that out of the 13, I was like the second best of the 13. I could throw an out pass, which is a dangerous pass, and you can have a strong arm, you'll be able to do that. And they moved all these other guys that were on scholarships that used to be quarterbacks to other positions, and so I ended up being the number 2 quarterback. And to make this long story short, in the spring football game, after the fall season, I ended up being the starting quarterback on the varsity and had a great, successful game, throwing 3 touchdown passes and doing lots of good things, and I got my full scholarship. Yay. So what a relief that was, you know. In the meantime, and while I was there my freshman year, I worked in a restaurant. I vacuumed the rugs, I prepared food in the kitchen, I did all the things that you can imagine. I cleaned the toilets, not after I had prepared the food in the kitchen, but that was one of my jobs, to clean the toilets, and so it was really great to know that that wasn't going to continue, that I would be on full scholarship. So anyway, that was my sports career in verbiage rather than having me read it for you. There's a lot of other stuff in here. I'm just going to end with one story, and it's a short one. It'll take me a minute and a half to read it. I got elected to the legislature in 1972. I went up to Lansing, and the governor at that time was Bill Milliken. In office 1969 to 1983, Bill Milliken still holds the record as Michigan's longest-serving governor. a politically moderate Republican who occasionally crossed over to the left, he possessed both a businessman's economic instincts and a progressive social values. During my first weeks in Lansing, I was the recipient of his generous hospitality and genuine charm. In an effort to get acquainted with the newly elected members of the legislature, the governor invited about a dozen of us to the governor's mansion for cocktails one day. We all took seats at the mansion's sun porch, enjoying our drinks and talking. Shaped like a half moon, the sun porch was all windows, with shades on that day that were open, allowing the low winter sun to bathe the room. As we chatted, the governor, in his congenial manner, tried to learn a little bit about each of us and our backgrounds. About 20 minutes into the gathering, the sun hit me square on, naturally highlighting me as the guest among all the guests in the room. Noticing that the sun was in my eyes, the governor got up, went to the window, and drew the shades. I found this a very lovely gesture. However, because he drew the shades only far enough to block the sun for 15 minutes, light was soon pouring in on my face again. And again, he got up and he went through the same drill. "Is that better?" he asked me. I was flabbergasted that the governor of Michigan was so attentive to a lowly 27-year-old freshman from the other party. "Yes, it is," I think I stammered. And then I thanked him, probably too profusely. "You're welcome," he said with a gentle grin. Over the years, I've wondered if the governor was consciously using this occasion and my moment in the sun to show off his graciousness. I don't think so. I think he was generally gracious. At the time, I thought his gesture toward my comfort was simply considerate of him. Later, however, I realized how politically astute it was for him to bond as he did with me and with the 12 brand new legislators, all of whom must have been thinking as I was, "What a nice guy. I look forward to working with him." Well, I did have my chance, and he was very easy to work with. We passed a bill that I authored and came out of my committee, a committee that nobody ever did anything with, and nobody wanted it, so they gave it to me, and I became the chairman. But we did the first bill to prohibit the manufacture and sale of PCBs. And because we did it, and the governor signed it, it became law in other states around the country, and then the federal government passed the same law. We did a law, we didn't do a law, we couldn't get it out of committee on returnable bottles and cans. Some of you all know that, right? That was a big thing for the state. The state was pretty sloppy, pretty messy, and we were able to get that enough petitions to get it on the ballot. The governor was the first one to sign it, and we passed that one 2-1 across the state. I had a bill that the governor signed called the Bonior-Hasper Tax Relief Act. It was just to make a story short here, it was a circuit breaker for seniors who were in their homes, who had limited incomes, who couldn't afford their property taxes, and we worked out a way to keep them in their homes. So I did that, and for those of you who are from Port Huron, and I know there are some are here tonight, we did the Port Huron tunnel construction hearings, and we cleaned up all the safety problems. 22 people died in that Port Huron tunnel explosion, one of the biggest tragedies we had in the state. So we had a pretty good record out of the legislature, which led to my considering running for Congress, which is in the next book. Anyway, I've spoken too long, but I thank you for your indulgence, and thank you for your support and for buying the book. Okay.
So we have about 30 minutes for questions and answers, and as you know, the microphone is not for amplification, it's simply for the cameras. So I have the privilege of leading the Q&A, so if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand. I'll try to get to as many as possible. Who has the first question? Okay, I'm going to come way back to the end.
Thank you. Hello, David. And I'm a student from China. I'm really glad that I got this chance to hear your lectures and know your book. And since we know that both China and Michigan may face challenges, though are maybe different, I wonder what is your opinion? What is the relationship between American and China, and since there are many ways that we communicate, like the program brought me here, it's held by MCEP, Macomb Cultural and Economic Partnership. I'm sure there are lots of organizations like that. They are building ways of communications and leaders. They hold conversations, and I want to know what's your opinion about it.
Well, I think, you know, it's important to recognize that the United States and China are the two powers in the world today. The Asian power and the power in the Americas. And they have leadership positions, and it's important that they work together and get along. There are tensions, no doubt, between both countries, trade tensions, copyright tensions, but there are also these wonderful programs like you've just described that Ed Bruley is leading here in Macomb, and they're wonderful. The exchange of people is really what makes these programs work, and so we want to continue that. We want to continue the open dialogue with China, and they with us, and hopefully we can get rid of some of these tensions that exist. It won't be easy, but it's better to be talking to each other, to be learning from each other, to be visiting with each other, than not to talk.
Another question?
Okay. On page 168 of your book, you give a quote about when statesmen forsake their own private conscience for the sake of their public duties, they lead their country by a short route to chaos. And then you talk about it applying to the Tea Party Republicans, but I'm not sure if I'm interpreting what you mean correctly.
Okay. That quote that she just read is from a play by Robert Bolt, who wrote A Man for All Seasons. Some of you may remember the movie that starred Paul Scofield. It's a fabulous play, and it's a very important play in my own life in terms of what it said. What I was referring to with respect to the Tea Party, when I was writing that, they had shut down the government in 2013. And I thought that it would be extremely important for those who were in elective office to keep the government open and work through their problems, as opposed to, you know, just take your ball and go home. That's one of the problems we have in the country today. Everybody wants to take their ball and go home, and nobody knows how to cut a deal anymore. Nobody knows how to get anything done anymore. Now that's an exaggeration in itself, but I think it's important to work through problems, and that's what I was referring to with the quote. Yep.
Congressman, my name is Eugene Grossbeck. As I told you earlier, like many people in this room, I passed out a lot of pine trees during your campaigns.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And I was honored to do so. And could you explain how you came about that novel idea? I know back in the day it was the Earth movement and such.
Explaining how the pine tree is going to be the beginning of the new book. But I'll give you a preview to the story. And we had one of the worst storms in the history of the state in 1976, an ice storm that killed millions of trees. And Ed Bruley and I, about at the same time, saw something in the Macomb Daily, that the Michigan State Extension Service, is Sharon still here? She worked for them for years. Sharon McGuire, she may have gone. Anyway, was passing out free pine seedlings. And I was an environmentalist in the legislature, as I just told you. And so we put two and two together, and we decided, whoa, well, we can do that. We found a farm in Allegan, Michigan that would sell us a box of for $40, 500 little seedlings. And that's what we did the first campaign. We were an underdog in the campaign. We passed out 70,000 pine seedlings. In all the precincts that we passed the pines out in, we won pretty handsomely, pretty well. And so we kept it up for 30 years. Even after I left, we kept it up. We do it in the spring, we do it in the fall, and over that 30-year period, we passed out 1 million trees. And people still today will stop me or send me pictures of their tree with their little daughter or son next to it. And now they'll show me the tree now so many years later, 40 years later. if it's still alive. They don't usually live much longer than that. So anyway, that's how that came about. And it was the tree has a very important piece to it, and that is its roots. And that we were trying to send a signal on symbolism about how important roots are in your community, in your family, in your life. And if you'll read the introduction by Ed Bruley and to the book, not the introduction, the foreword by Ed Bruley and Kathy Gilly, two very close friends of mine, they talk about the significance of the tree.
Thank you.
Yep.
Other questions?
Hi, yeah, I'm Christopher. I'm from Sterling Heights, and I've worked for the Democratic Party on a bunch of campaigns, but I've studied at George Washington University by the White House, and actually lived in China as well as a handful of other countries and cities in the United States. And it's always struck me, having lived in other places, that Michigan is particularly a place that really has a lot of potential to expand its sort of international mindset. It's actually the state with the highest percentage of people who were born in state. So my question for you is, how do you think that we can make Michigan enhance its more international mindset in order to make its economic development more competitive in a nationwide and global point of view, especially here in Macomb County?
Well, we live in a global world now, so we've got to be cognizant of that. And I saw some numbers recently about the percent of the state that had the highest number of its own citizens that stayed within its own borders. And in Michigan, out of the 50, I think we were number one, if I'm not mistaken, or number two, something like that. You know, people stay here. This is their, and we are, you know, a peninsula, right? So there's only really one way out unless you want to go up to the UP and sneak across into Wisconsin or Minnesota. So people are insular in that sense here in our state, but you know, you can't have not been paying attention if you can't understand the international economic imperative of being global and participating globally. And so I think that's sunk in, and so that's what the partnership that Macomb Economic Partnership is all about, is trying to break that through education and through opportunities, economic opportunities.
Thank you. I don't have a question, Mr. Bonior. Phil Randazzo. I just like the public to know how much you've helped the Vietnam veterans out back in the 60s and the 70s, including myself. You took on my case with the VA system, you and your staff members in your office in Mount Clemens. And, you know, you made me what I am today. And I really appreciate that, being beat up by the system back in them days. And also inviting 3 of us Vietnam vets out to your home in...
oh, yes, I remember now. Yeah.
You remember now.
Yeah.
And I thank you again for myself and my 2 daughters.
Oh, my pleasure. It was a pleasure to do it. Much a pleasure. Okay, so we're going to do some books, and I want all the St. Veronica people who have been waiting so patiently, and we're the last in line, to come up front, and we'll get them. Thanks for coming out. It was great seeing everybody. It's very special.